Everyone, this is Danielle again. I'm back with part 2 of my video series for Module 2 readings, this time with Chapter 5 on run-on sentences and comma splices. So I'm working in the same document, as you can see, where I talked about Chapter 4, independent clauses, dependent clauses, coordinating conjunctions, and subordinating conjunctions. So I probably will keep talking about those things and just adding on to that conversation. Now we're going to be talking about run-on sentences and comma splices because how we use commas and semicolons has to do with run-on sentences and comma splices. So if you've ever been told you have a run-on sentence or a comma splice, this will hopefully give you some clarity in terms of what those are. So again, the bullet points are basically the major things I think this chapter talks about. It briefly does talk about full stop punctuation, which I think is important to note, mostly because it does tell you the full stop punctuation between sentences are periods, question marks, and exclamation marks. And I just wanted to use that as an opportunity to say that really the only type of full stop punctuation you want to be using are periods. The only time we really want to be using question marks or exclamation marks are if you're quoting from another source and the source has an exclamation mark or a question mark in it. So in academic writing, we don't use we never use exclamation marks. Occasionally we'll use question marks. And we only ever ask questions if we can immediately answer the question after it. But questions are only given in very specific rhetorical situations. So that's the only reason I wanted to include that, is to provide that little caveat about what type of punctuation, full stop punctuation, you should be using between sentences, and that is period. So, and obviously the other two major things this chapter talks about is in its title, run-on sentences and comma splices. So I will be talking about those two things. So again, here I have subordinating conjunctions and our coordinating conjunctions, our fanboys. And I did take two pictures. They're not the greatest pictures. I could have scanned them, but I just took a picture with my phone of, I have one picture on run-ons from the textbook, and then I have another picture for comma splices that I thought did a really nice job in the textbook of kind of explaining how it works, because it's very similar to how I normally teach, how to kind of use commas as a means to join, right, complete thoughts or independent clauses, coordinating conjunctions, and then whatever comes after. And this reinforces what I talked about a little bit not a little bit, but I tried to emphasize it in the chapter 4 video, but is when you use a coordinating conjunction or a subordinating conjunction, is try to see that as a red flag, not a red flag in a bad way, but as okay, I think I am, or I'm using a coordinating conjunction and a subordinating conjunction. I need to see what's before it and what's after it, because that's going to determine what type of punctuation I need in order for this to be grammatically correct, and meaning not a run-on and not a comma splice. So that's why I like this diagram, because it really emphasizes that before and after kind of idea that I like to teach, that these ideas are coming before and after the coordinating conjunctions. And the same thing can be said with subordinating conjunctions, which work very similarly but slightly different when it comes to punctuation. So and here they do give the diagram. I talked in chapter 4 about how they don't really give the diagram for what the coordinating conjunctions are. They list them very briefly in a paragraph, but here they nicely list them. So you do have a diagram for what the coordinating conjunctions are. They give the meaning and the example. So meaning in terms of when you would use them and giving an example of them in a sentence. So let's first talk about run-on sentences really quick. So a run-on sentence is essentially you have a sentence, and sentence is a weird word in itself. Every time I write it, I'm like, is sentence the right word? Because it's a sentence can be a mixture. A sentence can be a fragment, but a sentence can also be a mixture of independent clauses and dependent clauses. So, but we just use sentence as kind of like a catch-all of everything. But you have a sentence that is missing punctuation and it just runs on. So, meaning it's just kind of going on and on and on and on, and you're not. It's missing some type of grammatical break. So it's missing a needed grammatical break. So I don't know how many of you were taught this. I was taught this incorrectly, and then I learned much later on that this is not the way to teach comma usage. But commas are when you want to take a breath, right? Between, wherever. That might be the case in creative writing. It's not the case in academic writing. There are hard and fast black and white rules for how commas are used in academic writing. It's not to take a breath. It's not, oh, I think I need a comma here. There are very specific rules that are tied to commas. It's not whenever you feel like using them. So that's the difference. And now I know every rule about commas, and there's never a place where I use a comma where I'm just like, oh yeah, I think that I could use a comma here. Every time I use a comma, I know that it's grammatically needed. And so it's good to learn this early on, because like I said in my last video, there's a lot of upper level courses that I've taught and that I teach, and students abuse and misuse commas. And anytime I ever ask students, what is it about writing that you want to know more about? Where I'm hoping to hear like organization, thesis, it's like commas. And so people are just baffled by the comma. And that's because, it's difficult to teach and it's difficult to learn. I don't expect you to learn it through this course, but I hope that you start to kind of understand a little bit of it and a little bit of the rules that go along with comma usage, as they are meant to work in conjunction with the coordinating conjunctions and sometimes with the subordinating conjunctions to bring together independent and dependent clauses, or independent clauses and independent clauses, to build thoughts and ideas, to convey messages and to communicate ideas. So I'll go onto that I'll just continue or I'll just do what I tell. So remember, IC and DC are my notes for my abbreviation for independent clause and dependent clause. And I use CC for coordinating conjunction. So if you have an independent clause and a coordinating conjunction, and then an independent clause, and this is reinforced in the image up here, right? A complete thought is just an independent clause. You can tell that these are all our fanboys, for and nor, but, or, yet, so. There's a comma before all of them. So anytime you have a coordinating conjunction, you're going to have a comma that separates the independent clause from the independent clause, because you have to separate them. That's just the rule. I don't have an explanation for the rule. Apologize for all the emails I'm getting. And I will continue to just use my birds as an example for this. So I will write about Ali. All right, that's my, and then I'll write a version of it because you see this version in the textbook as well. So these are both examples of run-ons. You could see that word is giving me that blue line under the bird because it's saying something's grammatically wrong here. You don't always want to rely on word, but word is a decent like capture of, it's not capturing that's anything is wrong with this, although if I wonder, no, it's not capturing anything's wrong with this, although this is not grammatically correct. So word is like an okay thing to trust, but it's really not because it's not comprehensive. So this is grammatically incorrect because if we look at our subjects, right, we've got, and if we look at our complete thoughts or our independent clauses, we have Ali is a loud bird. That's our first complete thought, and she can be very friendly. Those are both complete thoughts. Those are both independent clauses. We have our coordinating conjunction but, and we're missing a comma, right? So as soon as we put in that comma, that blue line goes away. So we have to separate that because this is not a dependent clause. And if you remember from the chapter 4 video, the dependent clause is dependent on something from the independent clause. If I eliminated this, then I would no longer need the comma. So if I had an independent clause, a coordinating conjunction, and a dependent clause, there's no comma because the comma actually works like a type of, I don't know quite, I never know quite how to say it, but it works like a type of stop. I don't want to call it a breath because I'm against that. Like you have the full stop of the period. And there's kind of a hierarchy to how these things give stoppages in grammar. And so you have the period, which is a full stop. You have the colon, which is the next most almost full kind of stoppage. You have the semicolon, which is a little like medium kind of stoppage. And then you have the comma, which is the least kind of stoppage between independent clauses and independent clauses, or independent clauses and dependent clauses. So there is a hierarchy to the most kind of stop you can do and the least kind of stop you can do. So the reason you don't have a comma when you have an independent clause and a dependent clause, and there's a coordinating conjunction between, is because you don't want to separate this by any punctuation, because the dependent clause is needing something from the independent clause, and if you have punctuation there, then that is grammatically separating or stopping in some degree grammatically something in some way, and so then that is not grammatically working. Whereas Ollie is a loud bird but can be very friendly, you need that to be one full. This now is the full independent clause. The full independent clause is made up of an independent clause, a coordinate conjunction, and a dependent clause. So that's why there's no punctuation there. But then again, if you want to have that, again, pronoun antecedent, meaning you have the she that points back to the Ollie. You wouldn't want to say Ollie's a loud bird, but Ollie can be, that's that kind of repetition is not always bad, but that's an example of bad repetition. If you have that, right, you want to separate that because you have two full examples, or not examples, but you have two full independent clauses. So you need to separate those out by a comma. You need to put some type of grammatical stoppage between them. This is another example we get in our book of a run-on sentence where it's just Ollie is a loud bird. She can be very friendly, where there's no coordinating conjunction between them. And the example they give is just to stop and then to start a new sentence. I don't think this is the best way to write because it's what I would consider a choppy writing. Ollie's a loud bird. She can be very friendly. And I see this in the textbook. It's if I saw somebody write like this, I would say join these sentences because they are, if we think about the meaning of each sentence, the length of each sentence, I would say they're similar enough. There's no reason why they can't be joined. But it's a run-on because there's no punctuation there. And there are two independent clauses again. We have those same independent clauses, but there's nothing to separate them. So it's grammatically incorrect, and that's what makes it a run-on. It's just a running on. There's nothing stopping it. There's nothing to break up the grammatically incomplete thoughts that are here and here. So there needs to be something grammatically happening in between them to separate those two complete grammatical thoughts. So this is a place where you could add a semicolon, although I wouldn't do that. I mean, you can do a semicolon because a semicolon, if you have an incomplete thought, an independent clause, and you have an independent clause, you can use a semicolon. That's the only time you can use a semicolon. It's not the only time. Sorry. There's always that. But also, right, that's the whole thing with grammar. There's always that exception. Occasionally you'll see them in lists if you have long lists, which you probably won't have in this class. But again, the semicolon has to separate two complete thoughts. And we see that when we get to, I think, comma splices. We don't see that in this particular part of the textbook. This one is just dealing with the coordinating conjunctions and the independent clauses and the commas that go before them. So those are the run-on sentences. If we go down to comma splices, right, and this is what I was just talking about here. Complete thought, independent clause, colon, semicolon. And that also gets into, right, semicolon is a slightly more full stoppage than a comma. And it's needed as a slightly more full stoppage because there's no coordinating conjunction there. So you need more. If you had like that, Ollie's a loud bird, she can be very friendly, then you're in a comma splice. Because now you're splicing these two independent clauses with a comma, and you can see that now Word is underlining that bird because the punctuation is wrong. Because that's incorrect. When we have that semicolon, it's correct. So the comma is wrong because it's not the level of stoppage we need. We need that semicolon because there's no coordinating conjunction there. You can add a coordinating conjunction there, but that's just wordy and you don't necessarily need it. So, but yeah, so what is a comma splice? So a comma splice, and they talk about here, And they say it right here, right? Not place a comma between two complete thoughts, which is what I was just showing you. Sorry, this is my writing that I grabbed that I don't. I'll eventually get to that, probably toward in the later videos. So that's where you're putting a comma between two independent clauses. So a comma by itself is not enough grammar. I hate the word grammar. It's not the right word. It's punctuation. And I want to make sure that I'm back in single spacing. So that's where, yeah, you've got the two independent comma or independent clauses, and you're putting a comma between the independent clauses with no coordinating conjunction, and it's not sufficient. And so you're splicing up two things in a way that grammatically can't be spliced up, and that's why it's incorrect. So just to give kind of one final example, I mean, there's so many examples I can give, but I don't want these videos to be exceptionally long, is if I say something like, just trying to write nonsense off the top of my head. Okay, so, okay, so first let's look for the independent clauses, which is by identifying the coordinating conjunction. You can see Word is always like, you're missing something. And I'll mess with this in just a minute. So right away, right, I've got two independent clauses. So if I got rid of that independent clause, actually I'm just going to keep it and just copy it. If I got rid of this, right, that's the comma splice, because we've got two independent clauses separated by just a comma. So that's what makes it the comma splice, even though Word is like, it's fine, it's not fine. So what Word is noticing here is that it needs a comma, right, because we have an and joining two independent clauses. Or we could do that semicolon. Or we could do that. And then this, I'll join the underline there, because then that entire thing, since I made this part, I got rid of the subject, so now that becomes a dependent clause. So the dependent clause, the comma is not needed, so this entire thing on its own is an independent clause. So again, this here, independent clause, comma, coordinating conjunction, independent clause, semicolon, independent clause, full independent clause that's constituted by an independent clause, coordinating conjunction, and dependent clause. So all of that to say, not using commas to splice or to separate like that two complete thoughts by itself, because that's not enough. of a stoppage when we think about grammatically what that hierarchy of grammar is doing in terms of stoppage, because we're leaving out the coordinating conjunction. Like I said, even though you don't have to, you can opt for that semicolon. But the reason the semicolon is usually chosen is because you're choosing not to use a coordinating conjunction. I could bring in a conversation of colons, but that's not brought into the text as of yet. So I'm not going to. So that's it for chapter 5. And my next video will be talking about the next chapter. All right. Thanks.